So here's the deal. I hate going to the gym. I hate it. I want to like it. My spouse really wants me to go. Since the Wall family arrived in my parish, I'm encouraged all the time to go. But I really don't like it. And I liked playing sports growing up. I played rugby and football, and I got it then. I enjoyed, getting in the mud and having a good time. And, if it was good for my body too, great. But the idea of 40 minutes on a treadmill running in the same place just makes me want to pull my hair out. And you just have to ask Heather to know this. I'm allergic to the outdoors, just straight up allergic to the outdoors. You take me on a hike somewhere, or if I end up falling in some grass, my eyes swell up, I start sneezing. I don't want to be outside. I like a climate-controlled environment, and I like looking at the wilderness on my television set, but the idea of being outdoors is not my favorite thing. So, considering those two facts, I wonder if I was gathered with the disciples at the bottom of this mountain, and Jesus had said to me, "We're going to go up that mountaintop to pray." I wonder if my response might have been, "You want us to go where to do what? Can't we just stay here and pray? We're already together. We don't have to go up there." I might have even had the gall to say to him, as I wonder if some of the disciples were thinking, "Do you know how much we've given up for you already, Jesus? We've left everything behind. Now you want us to go up that silly hill." And so I have to wonder what Peter and James and John are thinking as Jesus calls them on this journey. Mountaintops in Scripture have a sacred place in our stories. Whether it's Moses at the burning bush, hearing the great name, "I am," or being given the 10 Commandments to take to the people of Israel. Elijah struggling with God's path for him. Or the cross at Calvary, which we are on our way to during this Lenten season. God chooses to use mountaintops in the narrative of the story of Scripture as a means of revealing himself to the people of our stories. And so it might just have been worth going along for the ride when Jesus called them up there to pray. And so I wonder whether or not I would have gone or what my excuse would have been for staying behind. But I have to think that whether I went or not would have to do with who was asking me to go. When I was growing up, I was not quite as allergic to the outdoors as I am today. And one of the things I remember most about my childhood is that my dad, often on Saturday mornings, would pack the 3 children, me and my 2 younger sisters, up. I even remember my sister Jacqueline at 1 year old strapped in some kind of contraption to him, and 5-year-old Fiona and 7-year-old me following in behind. And we would go places like the Seton hiking trail or the Scarborough Bluffs. We would go and we would walk together. And I believed we had no idea where we were going, and that's what my dad told us, although I think he probably had an idea where we were headed. And when we got to where we were going, to a mountaintop of sorts, we would unpack a lunch together and we would enter into some of my favorite conversations. We would talk a lot about who my dad was and who we were. We would hear stories of what it was like for him growing up in Scotland and what he was like at our age. We would share things from our days at school, and we would get to know each other much better. And although I didn't realize it at the time, it was those sacred moments far away from the rest of our lives, out in the wilderness, that I came to really know how much my dad loved me and how much I loved him as well. I came to know him better, and I might have even come to know myself a little bit in that relationship that we entered into atop the mountain. And so, as Peter and James and John are called on this journey with Jesus, It makes me think about how God calls us onto these journeys and in different ways reveals himself to us, as he did to them. And that's well and good to discover who God is, but what's the virtue of it? What difference does it make in our lives to know God? What difference does it make to come face to face with him? Well, I think of Moses as the burning bush. And Moses was called to go back to Pharaoh and free God's people Israel, to lead them out into the desert towards the promised land. Or when he came down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments, these liberated slaves who were living in chaos and brought order to them. Or Elijah struggling with God's call and would descend the mountain to call a new prophet in Elisha. But in this story of the Transfiguration, Jesus encounters these two, encounters Moses and Elijah atop the mountain. And they discuss what it is he's called to do, what goes beyond the revelation of God, what he's to accomplish in his departure at Jerusalem. And different from these other stories of encounters with God, we have an audience now. We have these three, Peter and James and John, who get a glimpse of what God is calling Jesus to do. There's a 15th century artist, Giovanni Bellini, who has a portrait called The Transfiguration, and it is my favorite depiction of this scene. There are the three that we expect to be there, and Peter and James and John, and Moses and Elijah next to Jesus, and each of Jesus' disciples is taking a different posture as they encounter this scene. One is getting ready to build something. We can imagine that's Peter from the story, always looking to do something. The other, and we're not sure which, is starting to run away, terrified. But why? But by what they've encountered in the revelation of God. And the other has been literally knocked on his ass, just looking like this, not sure what he sees before him, but blown away by what's happened. But there are also others in the scene, much smaller and in the distance. In fact, Bellini's portrait doesn't even have them on a real mountain, but on flat ground so you can see what's in behind. And there are farmers and workers, there are people on walks, and you realize that the transfiguration is happening right in the midst of everyday life. That God has revealed himself to these few, but there are many around in the midst of God's presence. And I think that God reveals himself for many reasons, but he reveals himself to us so that we might know what's in store. And he reveals himself to us in ways we might not expect. But most of all, God reveals himself to us so that we might reflect his glory in the world. That what we've seen will transform our eyes and our hearts so that we can share that out into the world, so that God's light might be seen by more than just a few, but by the whole world. Yesterday morning, my wife Heather had a photo shoot. She's a photographer and had a gig that morning. So Rory and we were left to our own devices. And I had been thinking a lot this week about those walks with my dad going to different places, so I thought maybe it was my turn to give it a try. And so Rory and I, who often go out more with my wife present than without, we decided we'd go for a walk to the park. And you'll remember yesterday it was a little warmer than it had been in previous days, and so the park was a little bit flooded. And I didn't think much of that because, the swings were still available and we could get some things done. And so we had a nice little moment, and I put a picture on Instagram of him having a good time. And it wasn't but 5 minutes later, he went into the center of the largest puddle in the park and silly me, forgot to put on my boots. And I was trying to coax him out of the puddle myself, and he just wouldn't come. So I had to go in to get him. And this is not just your normal puddle. This is a puddle with thick mud across all of it. And because he didn't want to come with me, he decided that instead of stepping out of the puddle, he would just plunge himself into it and begin to roll around. So rather than a beautiful transfiguration moment that I remember having with my dad, I had to drag Rory home quite forcefully, screaming his head off the whole way. And I just wonder if there aren't times in which I am like Rory when God is calling me on a journey. I wonder if you're not him as well. That there are times in which God invites us up the mountaintop to pray, and for some reason we just aren't wanting to go. And so we kick and flail and scream and roll around in the mud. But God keeps calling us anyway. He keeps transfiguring in the midst of everyday life. He keeps making himself known in the faces of those I see before me, in that baptismal font back there, in the table we gather around in this room and the one we gather around downstairs. Whether we choose to go today or tomorrow or the next day, God keeps calling us on that journey. And perhaps when we go up that mountaintop, we will see his face in glory. Thanks be to God.